I share that to say, I used to feel sometimes like a little insecure, like, are we doing something wrong, where it just feels like every quarter our objectives are starting to kind of be the same thing over and over again. But it's actually the inverse. It's like, that's a sign that we're maturing and we're getting better at focusing on the right things. And then the work is to say, how do we get better at focusing on the right projects and initiatives and getting better at measuring that and keeping everybody focused throughout the quarter. Welcome to the Agency Profit Podcast, a show dedicated to going deep space on agency operations, which is just as nerdy as it sounds. I'm your host, Marcel. I'm the CEO of Parakeeto, a firm that helps digital and creative agencies measure and improve their profitability. Join me as I interview some of the smartest thought leaders and agency owners in our space and go deep into operations, metrics, and all the other things you need to get right so you can spend less time worrying about operations and more time executing on your vision. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Agency Profit Podcast. I'm joined again today by the one and only Kristen Kelly. Kristen, thanks for being here.
I'm delighted to be here, Marcel.
Well, that makes two of us who are delighted. We are officially done with what I'm going to call time off season. You took some time off. Carson took some time off. I just got back today from taking a vacation, and we're gearing up for Q4. And that sort of lends to the topic for today, which is quarterly planning, annual planning. We're sort of getting into a very intense season of that with Q4 kicking off. And so I think that's what we're going to talk about today, is why focus on these planning cycles and how to make sure you get the most out of them and they actually have the impact that they're meant to have, because they could be expensive, especially if you're taking a few days away from the company with a whole bunch of your, most expensive people. So you want to make sure you actually get what you need out of it.
Yeah, this is really apropos. And I think a lot of people listening, I know a lot of my clients will hopefully get a lot out of this. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's kick things off with why talk about annual planning in the first place. What are some of the challenges that you've noticed clients struggling with when it comes to setting the plan for the next quarter, the next year, whatever the time frame might be?
Yeah, I think I notice, a common thread among a lot of my clients is trying to take stock of what has happened historically, use it to how to use it to inform the planning moving forward, how best to do that. And then also how best to forecast the scenarios that they'd like to understand moving forward, how to loop in all their stakeholders, integrate all the initiatives they'd like to see be true moving forward. There's just a lot of moving pieces. And I think it's how to best make that all come together in a plan that makes sense for them moving forward.
Yeah, totally. And, it's interesting. There are a bunch of frameworks for this, and there's a few really popular ones, EOS and Scaling Up being two of the ones that we hear a lot. And then, there's all kinds of other ones. You could go find 100 different management frameworks, but they all kind of do the same things, right? There's a few universally accepted principles in terms of like what makes a good sort of planning exercise. And it generally involves some kind of look back. So understanding like what has occurred, how are we doing? And then some kind of look forward, usually starting at the highest level with, vision, goals, values, however you want to define those things. But like, what is the direction for the company? Where are we today? What are the gaps between where we are and where we want to go? And the key outcome of this exercise is generally alignment around a very small number of key initiatives and priorities that are going to hopefully guide the execution and cascade into like, what is everybody actually working on over the next period of time? And they generally also are going to come with guidance on some kind of a cadence to check in on that until the next reset, which typically happens on a quarterly basis, but every organization does this a little bit differently. So while there are lots of great frameworks out there, and we're fans of EOS, we're fans of Scaling Up, lots of our clients using those are awesome. I think it's important not to get too caught up in the mechanics of this and just focus on like at a first principles level. The goal is to make sure that we come out of this exercise with everybody being clear on what's important, where we need to focus, and then that they're able to cascade that throughout the organization. So people are doing stuff that's actually moving the business in the right direction. So with all of that in mind, let's talk about some of the things that get in the way, right? So regardless of what your planning process looks like, what are some of the key things that you see teams struggle with at a more tactical level when it comes to getting that clarity and then actually turning that into execution throughout the rest of the quarter?
Yeah, I think a lot of it, when clients have gone through this exercise prior to working with Parakeeto and prior to having certain visualizations in place, they struggle with, working sometimes with finance to model out certain scenarios that they'd like to see forward facing. So it's just how to integrate amongst different points of view and different stakeholders who are trying to shape and guide that conversation. That's one main challenge. How do you get all of those stakeholders to work together and on the same page? How can you have a flexible model to start talking about scenarios that are not just stagnant and based on historical data projected? I think the other challenge is oftentimes the growth goals that someone will have in mind are tied to a revenue target that's somewhat arbitrary and not necessarily tied to a model. It's just, and then how do you, they try to reconcile against that when there's just, the building blocks that may or may not be part of that actual target. Those are some of the things I see most often.
Yeah. Yeah. There's some good observations. I'll append to that I think, one of the fundamental things is at times there just isn't that clear of a vision, mission for the business. And so, of course, everything sort of flows downstream from that. And unless that's really clear and there's enough buy-in on that, then even if you have all the best data, all the best visualizations, all the best sort of like frameworks, if it's not clear what we're optimizing for and where we're actually trying to end up, then all of it will be sort of for naught. So that is, not specific to Parakeeto, but I think is just like a thing that is important, and isn't always easy, to have, but I think is the foundation for all this stuff. And then you touched on something that I think is really important, which is the tools and the information that are being used to facilitate the conversation. And often what I've observed is there are weeks, sometimes months of prep that go into, especially annual planning for companies that try to do a big annual plan. And this involves going and grabbing and cleaning up, a whole bunch of data, often because there isn't really a great system for doing this throughout the rest of the year. And there are key metrics that sort of need to be spun up for this one-time thing. And those models are somewhat static. And the danger with that is one of two things often ends up being true. Either there is so much sort of bias in the strategy and the plan going into quarterly planning that it's really hard to disconnect from that. And so because the models are so rigid and there's so much, work and effort involved in getting them updated, you end up sort of subscribing to the status quo. We're rolling things over just because there's friction there, which is not necessarily a good outcome. And the other possibility is you bring those very sort of static, rigid models into a conversation that is inherently fluid. And what you end up with is a lot of very subjective conversations because those pieces of data are just not able to kind of keep up with the conversation. And so there's a whole bunch of risks with that. You could end up making a bunch of decisions that are not good and not sound. You could end up making a bunch of decisions that are based more on subjective opinions or whoever's opinion was the strongest or whoever was most senior in the conversation, as opposed to like what actually makes sense for the business. And in other cases, you might just not get as much done during quarterly planning because you sort of hit a wall where it's like, well, this is the range of decisions that we're trying to evaluate. So let's circle back in a week or two when we've had a chance to update all these models to reflect those scenarios. And you might take multiple cycles to get that done. And next thing you know, you're a third or halfway through the quarter before you even decided what the quarterly plan is. And so it could really set you behind the eight ball. So I think there is an important sort of data component coming into this. That's combined with being really clear on what the vision is. So with that in mind, let's talk about, how to have a successful annual planning session. What are some of the key tenets to that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we talked about, the tendency to overcomplicate this. Where do you suggest most people start in terms of, let's start with the prep work. How do you prepare for success before you even come to this meeting?
Yeah. Well, the thing that I would say here is you got to be clear on where you want to get to, right? So that starts with mission, it starts with goals, values, like whatever the highest level picture is. And one of the common themes across all of these management frameworks is they place a heavy emphasis on quantifiable, right? So it's okay that maybe your mission and your vision is somewhat fuzzy in terms of how you articulate to the world. We want to help every agency in the world, be more profitable and sustainable. That's all nice and good. But you generally need to follow that up with, and we're going to accomplish that by achieving X, Y, and Z, right? This much in revenue by this time at these margins. And we're going to get there by, acquiring this many customers. And the pushback that a lot of people have with this is these are all assumptions. And that's true, right? That's the reason that you meet on a quarterly basis to reset these things, right? Things are going to move around, those assumptions will change, but you want to try to anchor that to something that's measurable. So that's the first thing that you want to make sure is clear going into this. And this kind of speaks to the way that we think about measuring things generally inside of Parakeeto, which is you want to have your model and your forecast, then you want to track actuals. So, I think one of the mistakes that people make is they put the cart before the horse in that they start trying to collect all kinds of metrics and data points and actuals, and they can spend a lot of time. And maybe you've been in this position if you're a finance or operations sort of leader at a company where you spend so much time collecting all of this data and you don't even use half of it during the meeting. And you're thinking like, why did I spend a week, digging around in spreadsheets to come up with this? So step one is set the anchor for like, what are we measuring against? What are the goals and objectives that we set out to achieve? What were they? And then let's go figure out how we measure up against those things. And that will really help you contain the scope of the prep work. And then the second thing that I think is important is, as much as possible, you want to try to anchor yourself to a model of the business that gives you the ability to be fluid. So I would generally value accuracy over precision in that prep and simplicity over detail, so that once you get into that meeting, if the target changes, it doesn't take you an hour to go back into your spreadsheets and reset all of the expectations and assumptions. That's something that can be done fairly quickly. So you have some kind of objective backing to keep up with the conversation. So those are kind of some hot tips for the prep going into that. And at a leadership level, I would also add, try to have a framework that people can understand going in, so they know what to expect from the offsite conversation. So for us, like, we've been doing a fairly similar format for a number of years, so everybody kind of knows what to expect when it comes time to do this. Maybe if you're just starting this process for the first time, try to articulate this to your team, a few weeks in advance, so they can start to mentally prepare and come to those meetings ready to discuss the things that you're going to be discussing, and having already thought about some of the things that you're going to be working through. Anything you would add to that, Kristen?
Yeah, I mean, you were just talking about the example of parakeetos and involving team and getting input. I think, one of the things we do is involve team members by through a concept called FUD, so fear, uncertainty, doubt. And it doesn't have to be the same, obviously, for every agency, but a concept like that where you're soliciting, feedback that is sometimes along the lines of something that's maybe difficult to talk about on a day-to-day basis that you want to surface and make sure that you talk about in a group setting. And remove any roadblocks around that conversation in terms of being successful moving forward.
Yeah. I'm glad that you brought that up. I do think that's an important thing to double click on, which is like, yeah, this is a space to have conversations that might not ever feel like they're appropriate to have in the day-to-day of the business. And so, yeah, the way that we do that is we have fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And we've changed the way that we've done this over the years. But now, in the weeks leading up to offsite, as a leadership team, we send out a survey to the team, and people can sort of just share, like, what do you have fear about? What do you have uncertainty about? What do you have doubts about? Like, what are all the things that are bugging you in the business, or that you are afraid aren't going to work, or that you have doubts are going to work, or that you're unclear about? And it's eye-opening every single time. As a leadership team, both in terms of like things that the team is worried about that we're not, things that are just like misaligned, where like we thought we've articulated something, but it's been interpreted or understood in a different way, or we thought we were communicating something enough, but clearly like we haven't. So it's a really, really good exercise for us to come to offsite prepared to address the specific places where there's misalignment or doubt or a lack of clarity and so on. So for the leaders listening, like, that's been huge for us. And you might do it a different way, but I think that's really important. And it also helps to start priming the team for like, hey, this is a safe space during offsite or during quarterly planning to like talk about the big problems, the big issues, because those are the things that we need to get addressed and get aligned on in order to go into the next quarter feeling like we're all working in the same direction.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've seen leadership teams tackle that with like employee NPS, and I think that the difference between that and fear, uncertainty, and doubt is just again fostering that sense of like transparency, emotional safety, and security, all that stuff going into that conversation. I think it's great. Um, so, in terms of the actual planning initiative itself, where do you see how do teams successfully pull that off? What type of formatting are we talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, we used to spend, if I think back to the early days of Parakeeto, we would spend so much time looking back at our quarterly planning sessions, like almost the entirety of the first day. And now, I mean, you would know this from the last few quarterly planning sessions that we've done. We spend almost no time looking back. And the reason for that is because we're looking at our numbers on a regular basis throughout the quarter. And so it's not this sort of big exercise. We don't have to spend a lot of time on it. We go into the quarter and everybody has a pretty good understanding of where we are. So we can do a quick recap. Most of our time looking back, we're spending on things like wins and what did we learn from this quarter. And we're not spending a ton of time sort of combing through data, which is kind of a rough way to start a planning session, to be honest. Not very exciting. So the ideal situation is you go in having already like been running on a decent cadence of having scorecards, having awareness of how you're tracking against the key metrics. And if you haven't done that, then I would try to make that really concise, right? So this comes down to having a framework. So everybody's clear on what are the handful of numbers that really matter in the business? What does good look like for us? And where have we landed relative to those metrics? Try to make it clear, try to make it concise. And that really sets a great foundation for everybody being on the same page about what's happening. And it removes a lot of the subjectivity as to what's happening. There's probably going to be some subjective discussions about why. That's great. That's where we can collaborate. I think that's the important place to spend your time. But when it comes to the data, ideally, have a rhythm in place already so you don't have to do this like big sort of reset on numbers. And if you do have to do a big reset, try to keep it really simple and focus on just a handful of metrics. And for most agencies and service-based businesses on the financial side, that's going to be your agency gross income, your delivery margin, your overhead relative to agency gross income, and your operating profit. Again, all relative to targets. And then we'd be focused really on the key levers for delivery margin, which would be utilization and average billable rate primarily, and maybe average cost per hour layered in there as well. How are those performing to target? That's it. You can use 5, 6 kind of simple numbers, and that'll tell the key story about the whole business. You might have another couple things that you're focused on the marketing side or on the client satisfaction side, but those are the key numbers you want to be paying attention to.
Yeah. And so, that's a good way to start by level setting. How do you get the conversation going again and structure it around the key initiatives for the quarter or the year ahead? In this case, we're talking annual.
Yeah. So if we zoom out, we're going to kind of get into what are the things that are true about all of the different frameworks around, planning and then execution throughout a quarter. And they all pretty much have the same 4 tenets. There's some amount of context building. So where are we going? Where are we today? That's generally the prep and the initial part of the conversation. Then you have a prioritization exercise that comes out of that. So the key outcome, and this is where the bulk of the work and the collaboration is going to happen, is based on that, what do we need to focus on in order to move the business forward? And generally, the objective across most of these is to boil this down to anywhere from 1 to maybe 5 key initiatives, key themes throughout the quarter. And this could be framed as a bunch of different things. A very common way to frame this is an OKR, an objective and key results, right? And that's a very common framework that's used for this. But essentially, it's like, what are the big themes, the big things that we're focused on as a team? And can we get that down to a very small number? So that's step 2. And then from there, what you want to try to do is organize that now into action plans and initiatives. And generally, what that means is you're tying metrics, you're tying specific outcomes or initiatives or activities back to those objectives. And you're saying, like, these are the things that the organization is going to be focused on that should lead us to these outcomes. And then that goes into execution, which involves communicating that to the team, installing whatever measurement cadences, scorecards, whatever systems are required to get that stuff happening, rolling that out, getting things moving. So those are at a high level, the 4 key things that you're trying to work through in annual planning. So after the context building, the second piece is the focus. How do we actually get focused on the right thing to do? And the way that I like to think about this is, let's start by identifying what are the metrics that need to improve in the business, right? So I like to work backwards from those things because it makes it really objective, and it sets a frame where there's a certain amount of subjectivity that's removed from the conversation. And it's then channeled into a much more productive conversation, which is, okay, our whole team is sitting here on one side of the table, and we're faced with this challenge of, our delivery margin is X and we need it to be Y. How do we solve for that? Right. And we can see that our utilization is high, but our average billable rate is not. So clearly, average billable rate is the metric that we need to improve. What do we want to accomplish over the next quarter? Then we can start the conversation collaboratively about, well, why do we think it's lower than it should be? And what can we do to start course correcting that? And that's where we start to identify initiatives, projects, whatever you want to call it, that we're going to focus on in the quarter to try to move that metric in the right direction. And it's all tied back to the thing we're going to measure to know if we're making progress or not. So that's how I like to approach the exercise: is start with the numbers. That gets everybody on the same side of the table and really kind of forces us into focusing on the right things.
Do you want some free resources to help you measure and improve your profitability? If you do, then I want to tell you about our agency profitability toolkit, which you can grab absolutely free in the show notes or by heading to parakeeto.com/toolkit. It's packed with training videos, cheat sheets, templates, and all kinds of other great resources to help you start measuring and improving the essential metrics that are going to drive better profitability in your business. And it's helped thousands of other agencies around the world do the same. So I want to encourage you to go and grab a copy of that. And if you'd rather get in the fast lane and just have our team of experts guide you through the process of measuring and improving your profitability, then I want to encourage you to apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. With that, I want to thank you again for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the episode, and I'll let you get back to it.
I think that you've just highlighted something that I see go wrong a lot, which is I see people start with the initiative and then they wonder what has to be true from a numbers standpoint to support it, right? And that's what involves a lot of the work and rework of, different scenarios. How do we make this happen and get the numbers to meet us where we want to be from an initiative standpoint? But yeah, the reverse needs to be true.
And I mean, look, we're guilty of that. We've fallen into that trap many times in the past and I think the lesson here, as we mature as an organization, we get deeper into this, is like, if we're struggling to figure out how we're going to measure this initiative, that might be a sign that we're not focused on the right thing, or it's, we haven't done enough thinking in terms of like, how does this actually tie back to our big set of goals as a company? The other thing that I've learned about this over time, and I recently actually had a great conversation about this with somebody who built and sold a company for just recently $250 million. We went out and had dinner. I had dinner with basically Tony Stark, the real life Tony Stark. And he was walking me through how his organization did OKRs, with a team of 200 people growing super fast. And what I started to realize was like, their objectives basically never change. Their objectives are essentially the same every quarter because their mission doesn't really change. And so there's generally a lot of continuity from quarter to quarter with like their big objectives for the company, those, 3, 4, 5 things that they're focused on. What is generally going to adjust every quarter is the key results and the initiatives that are tied to those key results. But don't be surprised if the broad themes for the business are going to be fairly static or are going to extend over several quarters at a time, because generally those big changes take several quarters to materialize. And unless there's a material change in the vision or direction of the business, those objectives are probably going to remain pretty consistent. It's just that the bar is going to keep getting raised in terms of what the measurable outcomes look like from quarter to quarter. So I share that to say, I used to feel sometimes like a little insecure, like, are we doing something wrong, where it just feels like every quarter our objectives are starting to kind of be the same thing over and over again. But it's actually the inverse. It's like, that's a sign that we're maturing and we're getting better at focusing on the right things. And then the work is to say, how do we get better at focusing on the right projects and initiatives and getting better at measuring that and keeping everybody focused throughout the quarter.
Yeah. And I think to your earlier point about efficiency, I think the reason why we're able to be, as a company ourselves, so efficient is because we do have that, framework and visibility in place to the metrics. It just makes that conversation really kind of dialed in and efficient.
That leads us to kind of the next part. But before we move on from that, do you have anything to add, Kristen, to that second piece? So focusing in on the right things and getting in priorities.
I don't, but I wanted to ask you, so once you've kind of dialed in your vision, how do you then go about if kind of evangelizing and explaining all of these things to rolling it out to the team so they have a vision moving forward?
Yeah. The biggest lesson I've learned around this is it's over communication. And this is something that like I could stand to get better at. I think most CEOs could stand to get better at this, especially the ones that are like me, where I have a tendency to not like repeating myself. But it's like what I've learned is the bigger your company gets, the more important of a job that becomes, is just to be like repeating the same things over and over and over and over again. Because just like learning a new skill, you could read the same information several times before you really understand it, and you pick up different elements of it each time. And so it's important as a leader to remember that like the first time you explain your vision to the team, they're not going to understand it the same way that you do. They're going to grasp some amount of it based on the context on that day, and then they'll absorb a little bit more of it the next time. And then a situation is going to come up, and you're going to explain like why you made a certain decision in the context of that, and it'll unlock something else. And so I think it's trying to install that. And this is a change that I'm trying to make moving forward, is like install the vision, mission, values in the meeting cadences going forward. So you have a natural function to like repeat those things, but you just want to communicate it every quarter, even if it feels repetitive. Keep communicating it in the meetings and cadences that you have in between. Keep communicating it to the team. Keep trying to tie decisions and context and, things that are happening in the business back to it. And just basically try to communicate as often as possible. And it's really hard to overdo it.
And for those agencies who really want to make a shift to become more KPI focused and explain some of those KPIs to teammates who may not have exposure to them all the time, how do we suggest doing that? We've got an agency profitability flywheel that helps with some of that, but really at a high level, like what's the recommendation?
Well, I think the thing that's been really funny is there's this pattern that I've noticed where people start doing EOS. And then they reach out to us and they're like, yeah, EOS has us doing this scorecard thing. And we've realized that we don't really know how to measure our business, and we don't really have any of this stuff in place. And we've started trying to work through it. We're realizing it's kind of complicated. And so what that is, I think, evidence of is committing to doing it is the forcing function often that gets you to do the thing, right? So you might have been thinking about measuring the business better for a long time. And I think a lot of leaders that I speak to about this are stuck in this kind of chicken and egg game where they're like, well, I'll start measuring the business better, or I'll start talking to my team about these KPIs when I have them and I understand them and I feel confident in them. And I'm like, well, you're going to keep putting that off until, forever, basically. And then that'll never happen. And so my challenge to those that are listening is, if this isn't something that you feel like is fully baked, then commit to setting goals around these things, and then commit to measuring your progress towards them. And then that will be the forcing function to figure out how to do it. And in a lot of cases, your team will be able to take on some of the load of figuring out how to measure these things. And if nothing else, it will expose the problems that need to get solved in order for you to have more visibility into the business. But that would be my highest level advice to people, is just like commit to doing it and define the objectives. And then step 2 is figure out how to forecast if you're on track to get those things. That will be a forcing function for you to work through a lot of the mechanical questions around how is our data structured? Where will it come from? How do we think about this? And then the last piece will be then figure out how to track what's actually happening. And it's going to be messy and complicated, and you're going to make some mistakes along the way, but getting started is the only way to get started. And so I would make the commitment on your next quarterly planning cycle to say, these are the metrics that we're tracking and these are the goals that we have. And we will know every week moving forward, or every 2 weeks, or however often you're going to review these numbers, where we stand. And then you'll figure it out.
How would you suggest that agency leadership handle things that regularly come up, on an annual cadence, like, for example, the need to raise prices, for example, to meet raises that are taking place, just really like annual cyclical things and topics. They're there. They don't necessarily always tie into like that big picture and big picture stuff, but need to get discussed nonetheless. Like, what's the recommendation there?
Again, I'm going to be fairly biased towards data, but I think this is where having a model is super, super helpful. Because the reality is, unless you are able to use data as the backing for these conversations, it's so easy for them to devolve into just opinions and become wildly unproductive, or for people to not really understand the impact of certain decisions and certain questions, right? And so, this is how we use our model. We use it every quarter. We come in and we have an updated sense of, where everybody on the team is at in terms of compensation, what our costs look like, what our overhead looks like. And then we can have a discussion about, what if we made this investment? What if we made that investment? What if we restructure the team this way? And then we can ask any other question, like, what would our pricing need to look like? Or if we don't think we can charge that much, what does our utilization or our cost basis need to look like? And we can all kind of come to an outcome that's just a big math formula that nobody can really argue with, and say, okay, our goal is this, the constraints are this, then these are the things that need to be true. And then, look at our current circumstances and say, all right, well, here's the gap that needs to be closed, and then get started kind of figuring out how we're going to close that gap. So having a model, I think, is such a powerful tool for working through all of those things that come up on an annual basis, and coming to that conversation having already thought through and looked at, how a different range of potential outcomes is going to happen, because that tends to be a fairly dynamic conversation. And in some cases, as a leadership team, you can just come in and dictate, like, here's how we're going to handle this. But as much as possible, you want to try to create some buy-in. And often there are a bunch of different ways that you can get to the outcome that you want. And so as much as you can, I like to encourage a situation where you say, look, here are the constraints. We need to accomplish this. And these are like the variables that we can't touch. These are the variables that we can. How do you think we should work towards the outcome? And sometimes you'll be surprised at how the team figures it out. But as long as you're getting to the outcome, that's the important thing.
So just listening to you describe the model and how it helps drive just a much more simple conversation, I think it would be helpful just to talk about how does Parakeeto kind of facilitate an annual planning conversation like this? What does our process bring to the table?
So I'll talk about this in sort of two ways. The first way is our assessment process, which is something that clients will come to us and work with us on specifically for the purpose of facilitating essentially this exercise. And it follows essentially the framework that we've described. It starts with gathering a whole bunch of data and context from the client so that we can understand where do they stand today in terms of their targets for all of these different metrics, what's possible for them in terms of their current performance, and then how those things compare to industry benchmarks. It also gives us a chance to ask them questions about where they want to go and what their vision is for the business. And that helps us figure out essentially like what's the objective. And then we facilitate a workshop where we come having looked at all this data and say, these are the metrics that need to get improved in order to get to where you want to go. And then we start facilitating the conversation about, here are all the different ways that you can improve these metrics. Which of these feel like the appropriate next steps? And, we've had a number of clients that after going through that exercise, go into their annual planning feeling so much more clear and so much more aligned, and they get so much more out of it. And they also, of course, get to bring that model of their business that we build and use during the workshop. They get to bring that with them and use it on an ongoing basis. And so that's, I think, a really powerful tool. So if you're in an organization and annual planning is a big to-do, or you feel like you're just not ever leaving with the clarity or the alignment that you're looking for, I'd encourage you to reach out, and I'd be happy to talk to you about that process. And then, of course, the other way in which we're doing this is with our ongoing clients, right? So many of those clients that work with us on an assessment will also go into an ongoing profit management plan so that they have this data, and they also have the sort of accountability to be meeting with us on a regular basis to look at it and figure out how they're tracking against those objectives. And every quarter, we're doing a quarterly business review with those clients and going through essentially a miniaturized version of the assessment. Of course, we don't need to do nearly as much work because, to the point I made earlier, we've been tracking this stuff all along. So we show up to that meeting knowing essentially like where they stand relative to those goals. And then the conversation is more about recounting, what progress have we made towards these goals? Has anything changed about the vision going forward or the objectives going forward? And let's revisit our focus, make sure we're focused on the right things, reset our targets and objectives, and get everybody aligned moving forward. So, we handle it using a similar set of principles and just a slightly different process in each case. Anything you would add to that, Kristen, having done this a lot, both the ongoing and the assessment portion of this?
I'd say that the road mapping exercise that we conduct quarterly, and revisit monthly for accountability is also just a really positive exercise for clients to get clear on the metrics that we're talking about, being accountable to and structuring the conversation around. For clients that have done that exercise prior to a quarterly or annual planning exercise, I think they go into those meetings that much more clear and informed on, what they need to be, talking about and structuring their quarter or their year around. It's a great tool.
One of the things that I think we've heard from clients, I think is important to call out, is that, sometimes having a third party facilitator, and this is part of the reason that people hire EOS facilitators, and pay a lot of money to bring them in, frankly, to facilitate that whole EOS process, is because they bring a level of accountability and a level of objectivity to that process that can really help create buy-in, and also lets people focus on their highest point of leverage, right? So it removes any one person in the organization from this role of collecting all of the data and then, being scrutinized on that data, or trying to facilitate the process. And it allows everyone to show up to that conversation as a contributor, and removes sort of some of that responsibility for providing truth on like what's happening, and places it on a third party. So it's easier for everyone to scrutinize them and scrutinize us with the data that we're bringing, and then of course get aligned and say, okay, we agree that this is what's going on, and now let's like work together to get this stuff done. And everybody is sort of a peer in that conversation. I think that that is such a huge and important difference in how that conversation gets facilitated. And what we've found, what we've heard from clients is like, we have never been this aligned. We've never been this clear. It's never been this like simple, what we need to leave here and work on as a team. And ultimately, to me, that is what we sell at Parakeeto. We sell alignment, and alignment is ultimately what leads to execution. And so nothing makes me happier than getting that kind of feedback after a team goes through this exercise, to be like, we're finally clear, we're finally aligned, and we can just get to work.
Yeah, agreed. And I think another benefit of working with a team like ours is also just providing some optionality in terms of addressing some blockers for certain KPIs. So I think, for example, oftentimes clients think that the only mechanism for improving ABR is raising prices. Well, we can talk about some alternatives. We can talk about some other ways to go about improving metrics like that. That's not the only metric, but there are many ways to achieve usually what they're trying to get at. And it's just, having someone to talk those through and what resonates the most, getting to that, I think is a big differentiator.
The last thing I'll speak to here is budgeting, because I know that's kind of a big focus a lot of times going into the annual plans. And it can be a really complicated exercise if the way you're arriving at those budgets is sort of very disparate and involves a lot of bouncing around between departments. And so I think, again, this is where having a model that takes into account the team, that takes into account pricing and new business, and takes into account sort of overhead expenses, and allows you, again, to like have a whole set of discussions, plug in a bunch of assumptions, and then immediately see like, okay, these are the budgets for all the different areas of the business, for our payroll, for sales and marketing, for overhead, for facilities, for delivery. Here's our targets for average bill rate, for utilization, like, and they're all connected to each other. Is, we've had a number of clients just like articulate how much of a game changer that is, and how much more quickly they can come to these agreements, and how much it sort of protects all of the different stakeholders in the business from being expected to operate within constraints that are not realistic or that are sort of disconnected from the fundamental reality of the business, just because that information wasn't available at the time that the decisions were being made. So I think it's another important one to call out. And, whether you want to use, our frameworks or our tools for that or not, I think this just sort of reinforces the importance of having a model that you can use to facilitate those conversations. It's such a powerful idea, and one that I really encourage people to make an investment in. Like, if you don't have a model that you can use in that way, definitely spend the time to build that out. And I would focus on that much more than the sort of one-time snapshots of data that are highly precise and may not even end up being used in the discussion.
And to your earlier point, that's, I think, the step where things most often go off the rails or get delayed, because they're just iterating upon that based on certain conversations, and it has the potential to really drag the initiative on.
So with all of that, Kristen, any final words of advice for our clients that are venturing into Q4, venturing into planning season to make that a more successful exercise?
Yeah, I just completely agree with your stance on prioritizing the numbers first. I think it provides a level of clarity that just really helps teams guide that entire conversation with a lens of clarity that they can just easily evangelize to not just the leadership team, but to the whole team to just, guide them moving forward.
With that, I want to thank everyone for tuning in and listening. If you have questions or you want to learn more about us, how we can help you with your annual planning process, by all means, reach out to us. We love to hear from you. And with that, we will see you on the next episode.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you've ever found yourself thinking, man, I get so much value from this podcast, I wish there was something I could do to return the favor. Well, today's your lucky day, because you can leave us a review wherever you're listening to this, and it is incredibly helpful. Of course, if you haven't grabbed a free copy of the Agency Profit Toolkit, go and get that. It's got tons of free resources to help you improve your profitability. If you're looking to get in the fast lane and get help from experts to improve your profitability and measure your most important metrics, then apply for a consultation at Parakeeto.com. We'd love to chat with you and figure out how we can help. With all of that, thank you so much for being a listener, and we will see you on the next episode.